Good morning, everybody. Today, in this video, let's do with the analysis of the celebrated jumping frog of Calaveras County by Mark Twain. Mark Twain spent his entire adult life writing nonfiction accounts, short stories, and groundbreaking novels. He started, however, at a very young age as a typesetter and part time newspaper contributor. It was during this time that he was able to experiment with humor in short, nonfiction, and fiction pieces that were often published multiple times because of popularity. Twain became known for his short, humorous sketches and clever little stories with memorable characters. Prior to the creation of his most famous works, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Twain gained acclaim as a short story writer. Twain's short stories, whether widely read or not, show an equal passion and aptitude for creating simple plots that are not just exceedingly funny in dialogue, but also exceptionally artful in the way they highlight moral issues at the end. In true Twain style, he maintains a fidelity to regional dialects and real people and creates for average social structures as money, power, class, and education. As a result, Twain is one of the great writers of the realism movement in American literature. The story under examination in this video is the celebrated jumping frog of Calaveras County, which is quintessentially Twain in these ways. Number one, it is simple. Number two, it is funny. And number three, it is widely popular, giving us insight into both the writing style Twain created and the cultural context in which he wrote. The celebrated jumping frog of Calaveras County was first published in the New York Saturday Press in 1865. Originally titled as Jim Smiley and His Jumping Frog, the quirky characters and original and funny storytelling earned the story an immediate readership. The story was reprinted in several other places and papers along with magazines and eventually gained its permanent name a few months later. The celebrated jumping frog of Calaveras County presents the time when Mark Twain was living in the American Southwest, which was still in the process of being settled. The Industrial Revolution had brought machinery and factories to the eastern United States. But most of the country, particularly the areas of west of Mississippi River, still relied on the land for economic development. Most of the land in the West was devoted to cattle, and the US government was involved in battles and embroilments with various Native American tribes in order to obtain more land. The West's growing population was influenced by both the Homestead Act of maintaining farm animals and also making money in the so called changing world. This period of America in the mid to late 19th century is very well portrayed in the story of Mark Twain. The story, which takes place in Angels Camp, California, is basically an encounter between two men. The narrator, our first character, who is Mark Twain himself, shows up to see old Simon Wheeler, who is our second character. Basically, the narrator, who is never given a name, has been asked by a friend back east to get some information about a person named Leonidas W. Smiley. He is told that old Simon Wheeler will be able to help him. That's really all the reader is told about the background of the encounter. Eventually, a third character presents himself in the story who is called as Jim Smiley. The story narrator shows up and asks Simon Wheeler if he has any information about Leonidas W. Smiley. Instead of giving the narrator the information he asks for, Simon, a very curious and monotonous storyteller, tells him about a guy he once knew by the name Jim Smiley. So Simon talks and talks and talks and talks about Jim Smiley in the entire story. Basically, Jim Smiley was a man of many schemes. In many different ways, this Jim figured out how to make money from his schemes thanks to his cleverness, and Simon notes his undying luck. At some point, this Jim gets himself a frog that he is going to educate. Yes, really educate and make him bet in order to win money. He figures out how to get the frog Daniel Webster to jump up and catch flies in queue. At this point in the story, Simon does interject that he has seen it with his own eyes. The frog that he saw could do all those things along with jumping higher than any other frog he had seen. Wow. Keep in mind that Simon's storytelling is what gives the situation a hint of humor and an ounce of regional color. His dialogue and the way in which he uses the regional dialect to explain actually is the nerve of the story. One of the dialogues is kept for you in the slide, which I would be reading. He catched a frog. Actually, he caught a frog, is what he wanted to say. Now, this has got a regional dialect and regional expression of English. He catched a frog one day and took him home and said he calcated to educate, which would mean he can teach to educate him. So he never done nothing for 3 months but sat in his backyard and learned that frog to jump. And yet, bet he had did learn him too. He would give him a little punch behind, and the next minute you would see that frog whirling in the air like a donut, see him turn one somerset, or maybe a couple, if he got a good start, and come down flat foot and all right like a cat. He got him up so in the middle of catching flies and kept him in practice so constant that he had nailed a fly every time as far as he could see him. Smiley said all a frog wanted was education and he could do most anything, and I believe him. The entire dialogue actually has got a regional touch. This is what gives humor and the continuity in the story. If we talk about the characters, we have got the unnamed narrator or Mark Twain as the first character. Then we have Simon Wheely, who introduces Leonard W. Smiley, actually in the form of Jim Smiley. And then we have the character of Stranger along with the animal characters of Jim Smiley. Let's talk about each character. Mark Twain is the author and narrator of the story, as well as one of its character. He is portrayed as the butt of a joke, the joke being having to listen to the fantastic tales of a garrulous old man named Simon Wheeler. Twain elegantly was asked by a friend to find out about an acquaintance of that friend. Twain thinks that this was merely a trick, however, and is subsequently frustrated by his entire experience with Mr. Wheeler. Coming across as an impatient, condescending man unwilling to listen to Wheeler, he sneaks away when he gets the chance. Twain speaks in perfect English and may be viewed as a symbol of the snobbery associated with the eastern United States during the 19th century. The next character that we have in the story is Simon Wheeler. He is a simple man who lives in a small mining town in the west called Angel's Camp. Wheeler tells the bulk of the story as later transcribed by the unnamed narrator. The narrator, an out of towner from the east who has been sent to ask Wheeler about a supposed acquaintance by the name Leonidas W. Smiley, is instead forced to listen to Wheeler's rambling story about a different man named Jim Smiley. Wheeler speaks with a heavy Western accent and spins a strange tall tale about Smiley and his pet frog, Daniel Webster. We love stalking, and at the end of the story, he attempts to launch into another tale about Jim Smiley's one eyed, stump tailed yellow cow. However, the narrator declines to listen to another story and instead hurries away from the tavern to end the story. The next character that is introduced is Jim Smiley. Jim Smiley is the focus of Simon Wheeler's tale. A resident of Calaveras County's Angels Camp in either 1849 or 1850, Jim is primarily known for his love for betting and will bet on almost anything, no matter how ridiculous. He has even bet on whether people will recover from illness and on which two birds will fly away first. It is said Jim would even make a poor bet just so that he could make a bet. Jim was considered a lucky man, however, and frequently won his bets. Jim was several pets, and of his pets, an old horse, a bull pup named Andrew Jackson, cats, chickens, and a frog named Daniel Webster, who is the celebrated frog mentioned in the title of the story. Jim uses these animals' abilities as the basis for many of his bets. He is tricked by the stranger at the tale's end, which contrasts with the visitor train being tricked by the local Simon Wheeler. The animals that are introduced in the story as the pet of Jim Smiley are as following. Now, apart from this, we also have a stranger. Yes, the stranger. The stranger is a con artist. He states that Daniel Webster isn't the prized jumper that Jim says he is and bets that any other frog could beat Daniel in a jumping contest. While Jim searches for another frog, in the story, the stranger feeds Daniel Webster kale shot to make him too heavy to jump and thereby swindles Jim out of his money. This situation, that stranger duping the local Jim Smiley, contrasts with Simon Wheeler, the local, who dupes Twain, the visitor. Now, these are the animals of Jim Smiley. The number one is Andrew Jackson. Jim Smiley's bull pup, Andrew Jackson, was used by Jim in various bets. The dog is described as a good dog that does not look like much and that other dogs often seem to get the better of him in fights. The narrator notes, however, that Andrew Jackson never seemed to be bothered by these temporary setbacks because once a bet was involved, his behavior would altogether change. As the stakes in the bets were raised, Andrew Jackson would bite the other dog in the hind leg and stay there hanging on until the owner of his opponent would give in and forfeit the fight. In this way, Jim's bullpup would win in his fights. Andrew Jackson died when Jim arranged for him to fight a dog that did not have any hind legs. The narrator implies that Andrew Jackson was a proud dog and died of embarrassment. Like the former president of the United States with whom he shares his name, Andrew Jackson is described as being determined and strong willed. The next animal that is introduced here in great detail is the 15-minute nag. The 15-minute nag is the name given to Jim Smiley's horse. An old and rather sickly animal, the 15-minute nag was used by Jim in many of his bets. The horse suffered from various ailments and did not look as if she could win a horse race. Nevertheless, Jim would frequently put her in races. Although she would start out slow in the last leg of the race, the nag always seemed to get excited and typically found the energy to somehow win the race. Daniel Webster, even the spelling that is written and the pronunciation is Daniel Webster, is the notorious jumping frog of Calaveras County. He is caught by Jim Smiley and trained by him to jump high, far, and on command. When jumping, he does somersaults and is described by the narrator as whirling in the air like a donut. Despite his jumping prowess, he is described as being modest and straightforward. He is often used in Jim's bets and is victim of strangers' prank. According to Jim, Daniel Webster can outjump any frog in Calaveras. Coming to the analysis of the text, in this highly significant humorous experiment, the author incorporates the traditional form of the telltale or tall tale into a story of his own creation. He produces a sort of literary tug of war between town and country, provincialism and urbanity. In appropriating this apocryphal frog story of his own purposes, Mark Twain makes numerous changes in its composition. First and foremost, he embellishes the anecdote with a frame in which he presents the narrator, Mark Twain himself, who in turn explains his encounter with Simon Wheeler in the mining settlement at Angel's Camp. The names of Bulldog, Andrew Jackson, and the frog, Daniel Webster, may suggest that Twain was merely indulging in topical political satire. In fact, however, his intention was to mock politicians and lawmakers as a species, an activity in which he gleefully engaged throughout his literary career. Simon Wheeler's tall tale does not attempt to size up recent history. Its content is purely Western in feeling and, as such, is generous in its ready acceptance of the exaggerated and the absurd. In the story, it is the vernacular, not the traditional style of polite speech, that emerges triumphant. The city slicker narrator receives, not teaches, the lesson. This is not merely the repetition of an oft told tall tale, redesigned and decked out in a new guise. From the beginning, it is made clear that there is no Leonidas W. Smiley at all. Especially no the Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, and that his existence is mere pretense in order to hear Simon Wheeler elucidate on the past experiences of Jim Smiley. Simon Wheeler's calculated ramblings admirably provide a platform for Twain's subtle and not so subtle humor. His literary greatness, in part, emanates from a perpetual malicious shrewdness that he frequently chooses to cloak under an assumed simplicity. His innocence is always pure sham, and the fact that he openly shares the secret with the reader is part of the fun. Talking about the themes that are reflected in the story, the first theme is the regional differences. Throughout Mark Twain's celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, Twain emphasizes regional differences. In the story, an unnamed narrator from the east visits a small mining town in the west where he gets roped into hearing a long, rambling story from an old man named Simon Wheeler about a gambler named Jim Smiley and his pet frog Daniel Webster. Through portrayals of foreign identity and differing communication styles, the story recognizes the cultural differences between the East and the West, but seeks to preserve and celebrate them both. Although the story presents these cultural differences between the East and West as being wholly distinct and irreconcilable, the story asserts that such differences should be celebrated and preserved for a healthy life. The second theme in the story is integrity and community. In Mark Twain's The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County, an old man named Simon Wheeler tells the unnamed narrator an out of towner a long and boring story about a man named Jim Smiley and his pet frog, Daniel Webster. Wheeler depicts Smiley as a passionate gambler who is willing to place a bet on anything. Once, he even openly bet money that the local parson's wife would die from her illness. Although Jim Smiley is not particularly well educated, or in the case of Parson's wife, not particularly tactful, he approaches his profession as a gambler with integrity, as seen through the way he trains his animals and conducts his bets. Although Smiley's strong moral compass makes him easy to take advantage of, as the stranger does at the end of the story, his integrity is ultimately rewarding, as it earns him continued acceptance in the community and presumably continued business from his peers. Meanwhile, the stranger's utter lack of integrity bars him from joining the community, permanently deeming him as an outsider. Even though Smiley may not be the quintessential role model, the story sings his praises and illustrating to the reader the value of living honestly, no matter what the end might be. Thus, the theme of integrity and community are very well expressed through the character of the protagonist. The third theme that we could see is the appearances and reality. When the unnamed narrator visits a small mining town in the West, he meets with an old man named Simon Wheeler to ask after a man called Leonidas W. Smiley. However, Wheeler launches into an unrelated story about a similarly named Jim Smiley, whose pet animals are unlikely heroes. Smiley trains his animals for various competitions which other people bet upon. Because Smiley's animals appear weak and unable to win, people are willing to bet against them. By investing his time and gambling money in creatures that look frail but are actually incredibly capable, Smiley proves himself to be a clever businessman and illustrates how appearances can be deceiving. Other people judge Smiley's animals based on their underwhelming appearances and assuming that the feeble looking animals will consequently lose their races, fights, and competitions. In fact, Smiley's mare is so slow and always had the asthma or the distemper or the consumption or something of that kind. Since the horse appears to be sluggish and even sickly, people understandably assume that it doesn't have the adequate energy and strength to win a race. At a point, Smiley also owns a small bull puppy dog named Andrew Jackson that to look at him you would think he won't worth a cent. Smiley understands the human impulse to make judgments based upon appearances, and he usually uses these biases to his advantage. In the case of Smiley's animals, appearances are misleading because all the animals having extensive training which makes them formidable opponents. Believing that the stranger is as downtrodden as he seems, Smiley quickly goes to the creek to catch a frog for the man, leaving his own frog unattended in the process. This allows the stranger to stuff the frog with kale shot so that it can't jump, and so Smiley will lose the bet. In this way, Twain encourages his readers to stay on their guard and always remember that appearances can be misleading. Thus, the story has got a perfect theme of appearances versus reality. So Wheeler's story is slight, but Jim Smiley, who would bet on almost anything, once trained a frog to jump so well that Smiley wagered his frog would beat any other. A stranger takes Jim's bet, though he confesses to having no frog for his own and forcing Jim back to the marsh to catch one for him. In Smiley's absence, the stranger takes hold of Smiley's frog, pries open its mouth, and pours a bellyful of buckshot down to its throat. When Smiley returns and pits his frog against the new one of the stranger's, Smiley's frog is actually virtually stuck to the ground. Unable to jump, the frog loses the contest and Smiley loses his wager. What makes the story so effective is Twain's handling of the obvious tall tale. While telling the story to the narrator in his own Western dialect, Wheeler prolongs the events of the tale by bringing in extraneous material, red herrings that circle and swim about but bear little relevance to the main action. Yet the reader is aware that Wheeler knows what he is doing. His straight faced delivery is part of the hoax, part of the tricky played on the narrator, whose style of literary formality contrasts humorously with Wheeler's colloquial freedom. The successful mixture of dialect, delay, deadpan tone, and absurd detail makes the story a very good example of the tall tale tradition in American literature. Thank you very much for being a part of this video, which has analyzed Mark Twain's very beautiful and celebrated story of Calaveras County, the jumping frog of Calaveras County. Bye for now.